If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Harlem had already begun its long descent from its golden era. The Harlem Renaissance was a fading memory. Factories had closed, public housing suffered from chronic neglect, and once thriving commercial corridors turned patchy. Redlining and discriminatory housing practices sealed the neighborhood off from mainstream investment, and the heroin epidemic of the 1970s left behind vacant apartments, abandoned schools, and broken families. In this landscape, three young boys, Rich Porter, AZ, and Alpo Martinez, grew up in overlapping streets but very different household environments. Their formative years were marked not only by poverty, but by the sense that legitimate pathways out were shrinking. As Harlem's institutional infrastructure weakened, an informal economy took its place. For many children born during this period, success had ceased to look like college degrees or 9-to-5 work. Instead, it resembled the men seen driving glossy foreign cars, wearing gold chains, and commanding respect on the blocks. Harlem's youth studied these men the way other neighborhoods studied stockbrokers or lawyers. And in time, some of the neighborhood's brightest and most charismatic would become them. Richard "Rich" Porter. Born in 1965, Porter came from a family known in Harlem long before he was old enough to run the streets. The Porters were large, deeply rooted, and protective of one another. Rich was charismatic even as a child, quick with a joke, naturally stylish, and effortlessly social. Those who knew him during his early years recall a boy who seemed to understand people intuitively. By his teens, he was earning money cleaning cars, carrying bags, and hustling odd jobs that kept him close to older neighborhood figures involved in Harlem's underground economy. He watched them closely, how they negotiated, how they talked to police, how they managed crews. Many young men learned by imitation. Rich learned by observation. AZ's path was more shaped by hardship. Born in 1964, he grew up in an environment where financial instability was a constant threat. His father was absent, his mother struggled to support the family, and AZ left school early. He worked menial jobs, a stockboy in a dry cleaner, an assistant in a neighborhood store, and experienced firsthand the low wages and limited future of legitimate employment for young black men in Harlem. Unlike Rich, AZ was not drawn to the street for glamour. He arrived there because every other door seemed closed. He possessed a quiet intelligence, however, a strategic mind that saw patterns, understood risk, and could plan several steps ahead. This would later make him an unusually efficient organizer in an industry defined by chaos. Alberto "Alpo" Martinez. Born in 1966, Alpo grew up in East Harlem, an area that experienced many of the same pressures as Central Harlem: underfunded schools, rising gang presence, and a growing underground economy. But Alpo's personality stood apart. Restless, energetic, and fearless to a fault, he developed a reputation for impulsive behavior even in childhood. Where Rich learned by watching and AZ learned by necessity, Alpo learned through trial and error, pushing limits, challenging rivals, and inserting himself into situations older boys tried to keep him away from. He was eager to prove himself, hungry for respect, and comfortable with risk. These traits made him magnetic. They also made him dangerous. By the early 1980s, each of these three young men was on the verge of entering a world whose structure was about to change dramatically. Before crack reshaped Harlem, powder cocaine had already become a lucrative underground commodity. The drug was popular among wealthier users in Manhattan's downtown nightlife, but Harlem's mid-level distributors carved out profitable niches, supplying neighboring boroughs and suburban customers. The money was significant, though not astronomical. The violence was present, though not yet catastrophic. The real transformation would come with the introduction of crack cocaine around 1984-1985. Crack did not require wealthy customers. It did not require nightclubs. It could be sold on corners, in building lobbies, or out of makeshift spots hidden inside abandoned stoops. It offered near immediate profit, often doubling or tripling return on investment within hours. Crack turned Harlem's struggling youth economy into a hyper-accelerated marketplace. For many teenagers, including Rich, AZ, and Alpo, this explosion created an environment in which adolescence and adulthood blurred. 16-year-olds commanded crews, 17-year-olds purchased cars, teenagers carried the earnings of CEOs in their pockets. Authority structures, families, schools, churches, lost influence. In their place rose territorial cliques, ambitious crews, and emerging kingpins. But Harlem was not only a marketplace, it was also a battlefield. The crack epidemic and the war on drugs, a collision course. By mid-1985, crack cocaine use had spiked so dramatically that nationwide alarm followed. Media outlets amplified stories of crack babies and super predators, creating a moral panic that shaped public perception. Politicians responded with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, introducing mandatory minimum sentences that disproportionately targeted black communities and crack-related offenses. In Harlem, increased federal funding to police departments meant intensified patrols, more undercover operations, and wider dragnet-style arrests. But this enforcement infrastructure was slow to respond to the speed at which the drug market expanded. For every crew dismantled by police raids, 2 more emerged. For every arrest, a rival filled the void. In this turbulent environment, the young men who could move quickly, think strategically, and inspire loyalty had a clear advantage. Among them, AZ began to rise first. AZ had been working at a dry cleaner when he first encountered the cocaine trade. He entered the business not through flash, but through opportunity. A local supplier recognized his reliability and offered him an initial package on consignment. A small but critical moment, as most first-time dealers obtained supply through far more dangerous channels. AZ's reputation grew quickly because he ran his operation like a business rather than a gang. He paid workers on time, avoided unnecessary violence, and reinvested profits into scaling distribution. His ability to maintain order in a volatile environment made him one of Harlem's earliest high-volume crack distributors. As his network expanded, he needed reliable partners, people who understood the neighborhood and could handle the increasing logistics of street-level operations. Rich Porter became one of those figures. Rich had already built a reputation for charisma and street intelligence when he connected with AZ. Unlike many young dealers, Rich understood the importance of image, not only as a display of success, but as a deterrent. In Harlem's ecosystem, a man who carried himself like a king was less likely to be challenged. He handled distribution, managed crew members, and maintained relationships with key neighborhood figures. He had an instinct for people, who could be trusted, who needed careful watching, who might turn violent. His talent made him a natural complement to AZ's strategic oversight. Yet Rich's ascent was not merely about business. He became a symbol on the streets, someone younger boys looked up to and older men acknowledged. His cars, clothes, and demeanor painted a picture of Harlem's success, one that contrasted sharply with the poverty surrounding him. This visibility, however, also made him a target. While Rich and AZ were building a structured network, Alpo was rising through smaller East Harlem crews. His personality made him both admired and feared. He brought an audacity uncommon even in the drug trade, willingness to take risks, willingness to use violence, and an eagerness to expand quickly. Alpo sought entry into larger operations, and he found common ground with Rich. Both were charismatic, both understood the streets, and both were young enough to view themselves as still evolving. Rich introduced Alpo to AZ in what would become one of the most consequential meetings in Harlem's drug history. Yet even in their early interactions, differences were apparent. AZ saw business, Rich saw opportunity, Alpo saw power. For a time, these 3 perspectives aligned. Together, they formed what would later be mythologized as Harlem's dream team of young drug dealers, a collaboration of intelligence, charisma, and raw ambition. But collaboration in Harlem's crack era was always temporary. loyalties shifted. Economies grew faster than trust. Success amplified tensions rather than resolved them. The seeds of future conflict were already present. Even as Rich, AZ, and Alpo built their organization, another force operated in the margins of Harlem's criminal world: Clarence Preacher Heatley. Unlike the trio, Heatley did not focus on drug distribution. His specialty was coercion, kidnapping, extortion, intimidation, and discipline of anyone who gained enough money to attract his attention. Preacher's crew was known for surveillance, manipulation, and calculated acts of violence. Where drug crews sought profit through sales, Preacher sought profit through fear. For rising figures like Rich and AZ, Preacher's presence represented a shadowy threat, one that was not immediate but always lurking. At the time, their paths intersected only indirectly, through mutual acquaintances and street knowledge. But as Rich's wealth grew more public, he inevitably drifted closer to Preacher's orbit. Heatley's crew watched Harlem's young kingpins carefully. They were patient. They waited for vulnerability. In the late 1980s, they would find it. As AZ's operation grew, so did competition. Harlem's geography created natural territorial boundaries, but crack's demand was so high that crews pushed outward. Disputes flared over street corners, suppliers, and recruitment of workers. This violence became self-perpetuating. A single shooting created a cycle of retaliation. A single robbery triggered weeks of reprisals. Crack profits escalated so rapidly that a teenager could earn more than his parents in a single night. That kind of money destabilized loyalties. Alliances formed and dissolved quickly. Crews poached employees from one another or forced them to switch. Paranoia increased. Firearms became ubiquitous. Within this chaos, the trio, AZ, Rich, and Alpo, maintained a temporary equilibrium. They expanded their operation to multiple corners, their names spreading through Harlem streets. But this stability would not last. A single event would shatter their empire's unity and mark the beginning of the end. That event came on August 21, 1987, when AZ Faison was shot during a brutal robbery attempt. By the summer of 1987, AZ Faison's operation had grown into one of the most efficient and profitable drug networks in Harlem. But success in this era came with a constant and unspoken tax: exposure. Wealth attracted envy, envy attracted predators, and predators in Harlem were never in short supply. Shortly after midnight on August 21, 1987, AZ was inside his apartment on East 132nd Street, preparing to rest after a long day of business. He wasn't expecting company. The knock on the door seemed routine, one of his workers, he assumed, or someone from his crew needing direction. But the moment the door cracked open, masked men surged forward. The attack was immediate, brutal, and merciless. AZ was shot multiple times, 9 bullets tearing through his body. He collapsed into his own blood, half conscious, barely breathing. The robbers dragged his body across the floor searching for drugs and money. They rummaged through closets, drawers, kitchen cabinets, even under the bed. They were not skilled criminals, they were desperate ones, men driven by the inflated promise of quick riches that the crack era dangled in front of Harlem's poorest. Miraculously, AZ survived. Emergency responders arrived just in time, and he was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors expected him to die. He did not. But the shooting marked the beginning of the end for his empire. The near-death experience left AZ physically damaged and psychologically altered. He withdrew from leadership, scaled back operations, and began contemplating exit from the game entirely. His internal calculus had changed. No amount of money could justify another encounter with death. In the days after the shooting, rumors spread across Harlem like wildfire. AZ got hit. He's done. His crew is finished. Harlem's underworld moved quickly to fill power vacuums, and nowhere did the ripple effects hit harder than with Alpo Martinez. With AZ recovering and Rich managing much of what remained of the network, Alpo ascended rapidly, but he lacked the discipline that AZ brought. His operating style was impulsive, aggressive, and increasingly violent. Harlem's economics changed his psychology. Where AZ saw structure and method, Alpo saw opportunity and dominance. He grew less interested in managing small crews and more focused on expanding territory. He also adopted a more direct approach toward rivals: intimidation, retaliation, and sometimes elimination. The attempted murder of AZ sent a message to every dealer in Harlem: no one was safe. To Alpo, this meant the game needed a new kind of leadership, someone fearless enough to stabilize what others saw as chaos. He started carrying heavier weapons, taking more risks, and seeking connections outside Harlem. It was during this period that the seeds of his future expansion into Washington, D.C. were planted. But before Alpo could look elsewhere, Harlem would face a chain of internal fractures. The first fracture came from Rich Porter's growing prominence. Rich Porter, Harlem icon, public target. The shooting of AZ left Rich as the face of their organization. This was both a responsibility and a burden. By 1988, Rich was one of the most visible young dealers in the city. His cars were recognizable, European imports with custom features. He wore high-end designer clothes, gold chains, and tailored leather coats. He walked through Harlem with the ease of a man who controlled several corners and commanded loyalty across multiple blocks. But visibility in Harlem was dangerous currency. To his peers, Rich represented possibility. To rivals, he represented threat. To predators, he represented wealth to exploit. To law enforcement, he represented a priority target. And quietly and persistently, he had become the object of attention from one of Harlem's most feared underground figures, Clarence "Preacher" Heatley. The shadow of Preacher Heatley. The Preacher crew, led by Heatley and his lieutenant John Cuff, operated with a different business model than typical drug organizations. They were less concerned with selling narcotics and more focused on exploiting those who did. Their methods included kidnapping prominent dealers, holding them or their relatives for ransom, extorting weekly or monthly payments, surveillance of high-earning crews, targeting individuals who flashed wealth publicly. Heatley's men were known for patience. They studied routines, mapped daily movements, and identified points of vulnerability: siblings walking home from school, girlfriends visiting apartments, mothers taking groceries upstairs. By 1988, Rich's lifestyle placed him firmly on Heatley's radar. The Preacher crew never attacked targets immediately. They watched them for months. And in late 1988, they found an opening, not with Rich himself, but with his younger brother, 12-year-old William "Will" Porter. The abduction occurred on January 3, 1989, a winter afternoon that began unremarkably. William Porter was walking home from school when a van approached. Inside were members of the Preacher crew. They grabbed him swiftly, forced him inside, and vanished before anyone could react. A ransom call soon reached the Porter household. The kidnappers demanded $500,000 in cash. They offered proof of life. William on the phone, frightened, crying. They assured he would be released once the money was paid. They warned them not to involve police. Rich, frantic, mobilized resources immediately. He gathered money from his own stash, borrowed from associates, sold assets, anything to get his brother back. But the amount demanded was extreme, even for a major dealer. The kidnappers insisted Rich had it. They believed what the streets whispered, that Rich was worth millions. But Rich's wealth, while substantial, was tied up in product and distribution. He couldn't liquidate that quickly. As hours turned into days, pressure mounted. Family members panicked, rumors spread. Law enforcement grew aware, but had little to work with. Rich tried to negotiate, to buy time, to raise the money. He never suspected that someone close to him might be feeding information to the kidnappers. According to law enforcement sources and later testimonies, someone in Rich's circle, possibly aware of his earnings, stash locations, or daily routines, may have provided intel to the crew. But this fact remained hidden from Rich. Days passed. More calls, more threats. On the streets, some began whispering that the ransom might never be enough. Then everything took a darker turn. While Rich was consumed with his brother's kidnapping, Alpo's mindset was changing rapidly. He perceived Rich's crisis as a vulnerability, not only personal but organizational. To Alpo, Rich's preoccupation threatened business. Money wasn't flowing at the usual pace, corners weren't supervised as tightly, and most importantly, Alpo believed Rich was withholding information about certain supplies and earnings. Tension simmered. Rich was grieving, desperate, and focused on his family. Alpo was calculating, impatient, and focused on expansion. Some associates later stated that Alpo felt he was being held back. Others suggested he believed Rich was not cutting him in fairly. The truth is likely more complex, but one thing is clear: the partnership between Rich and Alpo was deteriorating, and Harlem's streets could sense. After several days of stalled ransom negotiations, the preacher crew made a devastating choice. William Porter was killed. His death sent shockwaves through Harlem. It broke the Porter family's sense of hope. It hardened Rich in ways that made him both unpredictable and deeply vulnerable. Law enforcement redoubled their efforts, but the case was complex. Witnesses were terrified of Preacher's crew. Few dared to speak, even anonymously. Rich did not know, and might never have known, the identities of all those involved. But he knew one thing for certain: Harlem was no longer safe for him or his family. In the aftermath of William's murder, Rich became more withdrawn, more cautious, and more determined to protect his remaining family. He continued to move product, but his focus was shifting. Some associates reported he was planning to reduce his exposure. Others believed he wanted to rebuild quietly. But Alpo saw a different picture. To him, Rich was holding back. He believed Rich had lied about certain stashes, undervalued certain packages, or refused to share opportunities. And in the drug world, especially in Harlem during the crack era, trust was more volatile than gunpowder. By late 1989, Alpo's frustration had grown into resentment. He began speaking with outside crews. He traveled more frequently. He spent time in Washington, D.C., exploring a new market with immense potential and less competition. D.C. was suffering its own crack crisis. Violence was rampant. Demand was high. Law enforcement pressure was uneven. To Alpo, D.C. looked like the future. Harlem felt like a cage. But before he could establish himself fully in that new city, he made a decision that would destroy the final bonds between him and Rich. On the night of December 15th, 1989, Rich Porter was found dead in the Bronx, shot multiple times. His body was discovered in his car, slumped over, with no signs of struggle. He had been killed quickly, efficiently, and based on subsequent accounts, in close proximity to someone he trusted. It would not be until later, years later, during federal investigations and interviews, that the full truth emerged. Alpo Martinez was responsible for Rich's murder. The reasons, as Alpo later described them to authorities and interviewers, that it revolved around alleged disputes over money, belief that Rich was lying about certain supplies, the pressure of new ventures in D.C., paranoia about betrayal, the stress of the violent environment they operated in. Whether these claims represent the true motives or self-justification will always be debated. But the effect was undeniable. The Harlem Empire that once connected AZ, Rich and Alpo dissolved entirely. One man was dead. One man was broken and leaving the game. One man was fleeing to another city to build a new kingdom. Harlem, in the meantime, was left to absorb the damage, one of many tragedies in a decade, defined by lost potential. After Rich's murder, the network he helped build collapsed. Workers scattered. Corners changed hands. Suppliers sought new distributors. Harlem's drug landscape was evolving again, becoming more fragmented and more dangerous. Meanwhile, AZ Faison, already traumatized from his shooting, withdrew permanently from the drug trade. Alpo Martinez, now severed from Harlem by both danger and choice, intensified his move to Washington, D.C., where he would become one of the most feared and prolific dealers of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Clarence Preacher Heatley continued his reign of terror, eventually drawing the attention of federal authorities who would dismantle his organization in the early 1990s. The human toll continued rising as Harlem entered the final years of the crack epidemic. The murder of Rich Porter became a symbol, an example of how quickly alliances could crumble in a world driven by paranoia, ambition, and unrelenting violence. And the story was only halfway finished. By the early 1990s, Washington, D.C. was experiencing the deadliest period in its modern history. In 1991, the city recorded 479 homicides, giving it one of the highest murder rates in the United States. The conditions that enabled the explosion of violence were complex. Wide economic disparity between wealthy federal enclaves and impoverished neighborhoods. Public housing projects neglected by city authorities. A surge in crack distribution driven by high demand and low cost. Local crews competing violently over open-air markets. A police force overwhelmed, underfunded, and politically embattled. This environment created both a vacuum and an opportunity. For ambitious drug traffickers, DC promised almost unlimited revenue, if they were willing to fight for it. And Alpo Martinez, fresh from Harlem, was willing to fight. More importantly, he was willing to kill. After Rich Porter's murder and the unraveling of his Harlem network, Alpo began spending extended stretches in Washington. He had visited the city before, but now he was moving with intention, seeking connections, establishing safe houses, and quietly studying local traffic patterns. DC was not Harlem. The dealers were younger, the turf wars more chaotic, the rules more fluid, the hierarchy less established. In Harlem, Alpo had risen within an existing structure. In DC, he intended to create his own. By the spring of 1990, he had embedded himself in the city's underworld. He arrived with a reputation for violence, experience running multi-layer operations, enough capital to buy high-quality product, a willingness to outspend or eliminate competitors. Word spread quickly. Figures in the city's established drug circles noticed the newcomer with Harlem swagger, expensive cars, and a growing crew of local recruits. Some saw him as a potential partner, others saw him as a threat. But Alpo's ambitions extended beyond alliances. He was seeking something larger, a new kingdom to replace the one he had destroyed in Harlem. To understand Alpo's rise in DC, it's impossible to ignore the lingering presence of Rayful Edmond III, once the city's undisputed drug kingpin. Though Edmond had been arrested in 1989, his influence continued to shape the criminal landscape. Rayful's organization had been sophisticated, highly structured, connected to the Medellin cartel, and backed by immense wealth. His arrest created a power vacuum. Many smaller crews tried to fill it, often resulting in street-level chaos. Alpo saw the absence of Edmond as an opportunity. He admired Rayful's scale, but believed he could operate more efficiently and more ruthlessly. Unlike Rayful, who delegated violence, Alpo frequently carried it out personally. His reputation from Harlem preceded him. In a city already feared for homicide rates, Alpo stood out for a simple reason. He killed for control, not survival. Alpo didn't attempt to replicate Harlem's structure. Instead, he adapted to DC's unique environment. His strategy involved several key steps. 1. Recruit young, loyal, disconnected workers. Alpo focused on teens and men in their early 20s who had no prior deep crew loyalties, desire to earn quickly, respect for Alpo's Harlem pedigree, willingness to use extreme violence. These recruits saw him as a mentor, someone who could teach them the business with confidence and flair. They were drawn to his stories of Harlem, his wealth, and his fearlessness. Instead of relying on street corners alone, Alpo operated from apartments in northeast DC, motels, abandoned buildings, short-term rentals. This fluid infrastructure helped him stay mobile and avoid detection. The violence was not random, it was strategic. Alpo believed that killing early and decisively prevented future challenges. He also believed in eliminating anyone who showed signs of disloyalty, competence sufficient to challenge him, excessive ambition, knowledge of sensitive information. This approach built an aura of terror around his name. It also accelerated law enforcement attention. One of the earliest and most important murders associated with Alpo's DC rise was that of Michael Frey Friend, a charismatic local dealer. Accounts vary on the exact motive, but two factors consistently appear in investigative files: a dispute over money owed, Alpo's suspicion that Frey might become a liability. Frey was well liked, respected, and connected, precisely the kind of figure who could challenge Alpo's growing power. Alpo decided to neutralize the threat. Frey was killed, his body left as a message. The murder reverberated through the DC underworld. People whispered that the new Harlem dealer was not just another hustler, he was a problem. Fear intensified. So did Alpo's confidence. In Harlem, Alpo's violence had been sporadic, usually connected to disputes, retaliation, or calculated intimidation. In DC, the violence became systemic. Several murders, many committed with the help of his young protege Wayne Silk Perry, occurred between 1990 and 1991. Silk Perry himself was a feared gunman, known throughout DC for his ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty to Alpo. With Perry at his side, Alpo's organization grew more lethal and more unpredictable. Investigators would later connect the pair to murders of rivals, murders of suspected informants, murders of associates who violated rules, murders used to consolidate territory. This evolution reflected both environment and psychology. DC's illicit economy rewarded aggression. Alpo thrived in it, but every killing created more witnesses, more enemies, and more reasons for federal authorities to pay attention. While Alpo was expanding his DC presence, the city's political climate was becoming increasingly fraught. Mayor Marion Barry's administration faced heavy scrutiny due to the crack epidemic exploding in plain view. Media outlets described DC as the murder capital. Congress debated federal intervention in the city's governance. This pressure translated directly into federal mandates, expanded budgets for narcotics investigations, increased cooperation between DC, police and federal agencies, wider use of wiretaps, new surveillance technology, focus on large-scale distributors. Alpo's activities fit the emerging profile perfectly, connected to interstate distribution, linked to multiple homicides, moving large quantities of high-quality cocaine, operating across state lines between New York, Maryland, and DC. The DEA, FBI, and Metropolitan Police intelligence units all began monitoring him, and as evidence accumulated, internal cracks formed within Alpo's circle. Alpo's paranoia had already been intense in Harlem. In DC, it intensified further for two reasons. His crew was younger and less experienced. He had committed far more murders in less time. He began suspecting betrayal everywhere. Associates who asked too many questions, drivers who deviated from routes, street workers who took too long to return with money, friends who showed signs of hesitation. Some of these suspicions led to violence. Others led to divisive decisions that weakened his organization. By late 1991, several associates had flipped, quietly providing law enforcement with information, maps of stash houses, vehicle descriptions, and details of Alpo's movements. One informant in particular provided a breakthrough: information linking Alpo to the murder of Rich Porter. This revelation was instrumental in pushing federal agencies to make their move. But the capture wouldn't happen in DC. It would happen where everything began, back in the Northeast Corridor. In late 1991, federal authorities, combining efforts from New York and Washington, executed a coordinated operation to arrest Alpo. They tracked his movements between cities, monitored his associates, and finally intercepted him in the region. The exact moment of the arrest was anticlimactic compared to the chaos surrounding his life. There was no shootout, no chase, no standoff. He was taken into custody quietly, but the aftermath was explosive. Investigators linked Alpo to multiple homicides in DC and several murders in New York. Large-scale interstate drug operations. Facing the possibility of the death penalty or multiple life sentences, Alpo made a decision that stunned many. he became a cooperating witness. This cooperation would dismantle parts of DC's underworld, take down violent actors, and sever remaining remnants of his organization. But it also sealed his fate on the streets. In the criminal world, cooperation meant eternal exile. Still, for Alpo, survival outweighed legacy. After his arrest and cooperation, Wayne Silk Perry was arrested, tried, and received multiple life sentences. Dozens of DC associates were charged. Stash houses were raided. Suppliers were arrested. Local turf wars shifted dramatically. Informants exposed entire webs of conspiracy. The collapse of Alpo's network was rapid, a stark contrast to the long process it took to build. Federal prosecutors often described the takedown of Alpo and Perry as one of the most significant blows to DC's violent drug trade in the early 1990s. The city's homicide count began to decline gradually in subsequent years, and the legend of Alpo Martinez, once feared, admired, and notorious, morphed into something different, a cautionary tale. A study in ambition gone berserk, a story of brilliance overshadowed by brutality, a symbol of how the crack era devoured its kings. The human cost of Alpo's DC reign. Beyond arrests and headlines, the human toll was immense. Families shattered by murders, entire blocks traumatized, young men pulled into cycles of violence, mothers burying sons, communities afraid to speak, children growing up without fathers, entire neighborhoods reshaped by trauma. Alpo's story was never simply about a kingpin rising and falling. It was about a city grappling with forces larger than itself: poverty, policy failures, addiction, and systemic neglect. DC did not create Alpo, but it provided an ecosystem where someone like him could thrive, until he burned it down from the inside. The era closed with him behind bars, and hundreds of lives altered forever. But the story does not end in DC. There is still the final arc, the legal aftermath, the years in witness protection, the long shadow of Rich Porter's murder, and ultimately, Alpo's violent death decades later. When Alpo Martinez entered the federal courtroom in 1992, the atmosphere felt strangely detached from the chaos he had unleashed on two cities. The man who once commanded corners in Harlem and instilled fear across Washington, D.C., now stood behind a table in a suit too large for his frame, shackled, expressionless. Defense attorneys spoke in calm, rehearsed tones. Prosecutors reviewed documents, witness lists, flowcharts of his organization, and evidence gathered over months of investigation. None of the intensity, bloodshed, or fear that had defined Alpo's reign registered in that sterile environment. It was as if violence dissolved in fluorescent lights and legal language. The courtroom was not the street. The rules were different here. And in this arena, Alpo had already made the choice he believed would save his life. He cooperated, he testified, he provided details, and in exchange, the government spared him from the punishment that would have otherwise been unavoidable. His cooperation implicated dozens of individuals in DC and New York. It also confirmed, for many who had long suspected but lacked proof, the role he played in the murder of Rich Porter. For the Porter family, the revelation brought no closure. Rich was gone. His younger brother, William, was gone. Harlem had changed. Justice, if it existed at all in this story, felt hollow. But the legal process moved forward with clinical precision. Alpo received a reduced sentence. Wayne Silk Perry received multiple life sentences. Other associates were convicted or took pleas. The remnants of Alpo's DC operation disintegrated. It was the formal end of an era, sealed not on the streets where it was born, but in a federal courthouse where the past was converted into paperwork and prison terms. And yet the story refused to fade. 2. Preacher Heatley falls, early, mid-1990s. While Alpo was entering cooperation agreements, another major criminal figure from Harlem's violent underworld was facing the collapse of his empire, Clarence Preacher Heatley. For more than a decade, Heatley and his organization had terrorized Harlem through kidnappings, extortion, murder, manipulation of vulnerable neighborhood residents, a psychological grip rooted in fear. He did not operate like the flashy drug dealers of the era. Preacher's power came from silence and shadows. He studied people, exploited their routines, leveraged their weaknesses, and weaponized their vulnerabilities. Federal pressure intensified as the 1990s progressed. Witnesses who had once been terrified found small openings to speak. Some members of his own crew began cooperating. Victims identified patterns that linked unrelated incidents. By the mid-1990s, Heatley and several key associates were indicted. The government attributed dozens of crimes to his organization, including the kidnapping and murder of William Porter, the case that had haunted Harlem since 1989. With Heatley removed, a long-standing source of terror finally loosened its grip. But as with Alpo's downfall, justice felt incomplete. Too many lives were gone, too many families devastated, too many memories scarred. Harlem wanted peace, but it was still recovering from an epidemic that had reshaped its very architecture. While the criminal empires of Harlem collapsed around him, AZ Faison moved in a radically different direction. After barely surviving the 1987 shooting and stepping away from the drug trade, AZ began speaking publicly about his experiences. He participated in interviews, community discussions, and youth programs. In the late 1990s, he collaborated on Game Over, a semi-autobiographical project detailing his life in Harlem's drug underworld. AZ's reflections were striking because they lacked sensationalism. He did not glamorize the past. He did not boast. He did not hide the contradictions. He acknowledged his mistakes, the lure of fast money, the culture of the era, and the trauma that haunted survivors. His voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through the worst outcomes and recognized how close he had come to dying in a pool of blood on his apartment floor. Yet even as AZ tried to build something constructive from his past, the ghosts remained. The loss of friends, the degradation of Harlem during the crack years, the fragmentation of families, the murder of Rich, the kidnapping of William, his own brush with death. AZ transformed, but the environment that shaped him remained carved into the city's memory. As the 1990s progressed, Harlem began to change. The crack epidemic had peaked. Major traffickers were incarcerated or dead. The violent intensity of the 1980s slowly receded, but the recovery was uneven. Signs of reconstruction. Community groups expanded outreach efforts. Churches and local leaders worked to restore stability. New businesses opened along 125th Street. Cultural institutions revived neighborhood pride. Federal programs targeted neglected housing. Signs of lasting damage. Abandoned buildings remained scarred. Poverty persisted across multiple blocks. Thousands of Harlem residents were incarcerated. Families fractured by addiction struggled to repair. Generational trauma lingered. The names Rich, AZ, and Alpo became cautionary symbols, invoked not only in the streets, but also in barbershops, classrooms, documentaries, and discussions about the consequences of the crack era. In many ways, the story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to Harlem, a city still rebuilding itself from the inside out. In federal custody, Alpo lived a life both isolated and strangely insulated. As a cooperating witness, he was housed away from the general population. His days passed in routines: meals, exercise, occasional interviews, restricted movements, and the endless monotony of prison time. To many inmates, his name was synonymous with betrayal. To law enforcement, he was a valuable source of intelligence. To Harlem, he was a pariah. To DC, he was a ghost whose legacy was measured in bodies. Yet Alpo did not disappear from public consciousness. Rumors circulated periodically. Had he changed? Did he regret anything? Would he ever be released? What would happen to him if he returned to the streets? His legend grew through retellings, distorted, embellished, reinterpreted. By the early 2010s, younger generations who hadn't lived through the era knew him only as a mythic figure, often stripped of context and presented as folklore. Then, in 2015, reality reasserted itself. Alpo Martinez was released from federal custody. He re-entered society under a new identity, protected by the Witness Protection Program. But anonymity never suited the man who once craved visibility. After his release, Alpo split time between different regions, including Maine and eventually New York City. What he failed to grasp or refused to accept was that time does not erase certain reputations, particularly not in Harlem, particularly not for a man who killed a beloved figure like Rich Porter and cooperated with authorities. Despite being in witness protection, Alpo began making appearances in public spaces. He drove through Harlem. He spoke to people who recognized him. He showed off motorcycles and cars. He allowed himself to be photographed. He recorded videos discussing his past. It was as if the very anonymity designed to protect him felt like a prison, and visibility, even dangerous visibility, was the only air he could breathe. This behavior baffled many who understood the culture. It also alarmed law enforcement. Most importantly, it reignited long-standing resentments in Harlem. Decades had passed since Rich Porter's murder, but wounds had never healed. Families had not forgotten. The streets had not forgiven. Some circles considered Alpo's survival an affront. He was a walking provocation, a reminder of a painful era many wished would stay buried. And then, on October 31st, 2021, the inevitable happened. It was early morning in Harlem, just before sunrise. Alpo was driving a red pickup truck, a vehicle that stood out sharply against the dim streetlights. Gunfire erupted, multiple shots pierced the truck's windows and body. Alpo attempted to drive, then crashed. He died shortly after. The news spread instantly across Harlem, New York City, and social media. For some, it brought a sense of closure. For others, a reminder of old pain. For many younger people, it felt like the final chapter of a story they only knew as legend. Investigators suggested the killing was tied to his history, a long-awaited act of retribution rather than a random incident. It was a violent end that mirrored the life he had once lived, decades removed from the height of his notoriety. But the meaning of his death extended beyond a single man. The intertwined stories of Rich Porter, AZ Faison, and Alpo Martinez continue to resonate because they represent far more than individual lives. They represent a generation shaped by the crack epidemic, economic collapse in black neighborhoods, policy failures of the war on drugs, cultural pressures rooted in survival and status, cycles of violence created by scarcity and inequality. They also represent three paths. AZ, survived, reflected, warned others. Rich, killed at the height of his potential. Alpo, rose, fell, cooperated, and died violently. Their lives mirrored Harlem's trajectory during the 1980s and early 1990s. Rapid escalation, high visibility, internal fragmentation, violent peaks, slow and painful reconstruction. The crack era reshaped the neighborhood's identity, and the stories of these men became cultural markers, referenced in films, songs, interviews, books, and discussions about crime, trauma, and systemic failure. They are remembered not because their crimes were extraordinary, but because they encapsulated a unique and turbulent chapter in American urban history. The true legacy of this era extends beyond any single figure. The war on drugs reshaped policing, sentencing, and incarceration. Communities were devastated by addiction, violence, and mass imprisonment. Generational trauma rippled through families. Housing policies, economic neglect, and political failures combined to create conditions that facilitated entire criminal economies. Rich, Alpo, and AZ were not anomalies. They were products of the landscape, and, in many ways, cautionary examples of what that landscape could produce. Their story is ultimately a story about American policy, urban decay, inequality, survival, culture, tragedy, transformation, and the lingering question of what might have been if any of them had been born in a different time, a different city, or a different socio-economic reality. 10. Closing reflections. A city remembered today. Harlem continues to evolve. Luxury developments rise where abandoned buildings once stood. New businesses fill blocks that used to be open-air drug markets. Generations who never lived through the crack era inherit its stories through films, documentaries, or whispered recollections from older relatives. But if you walk the streets carefully, Lenox Avenue, 145th, St. Nicholas, 125th Street, you can still feel the echoes. Every corner has a history. Every block remembers a chapter. And the story of Rich, AZ, and Alpo is woven into the asphalt. Not as glorification, not as mythology, but as memory. An imprint of a time when an entire neighborhood stood at the crossroads of survival and self-destruction. The era is gone, but the lessons remain, and the story endures, because it is not just the story of three men. It is the story of Harlem itself.